Can you see the screen now?
Yes.
Okay. Well, yes. I mean, the title. When I first gave this talk in Caracas, I mean through Zoom certainly, a few months ago, and when I proposed this talk to the Sephardi community there, um, I prefer to use the notion of the split mind, but they said, the split mind is too abstract for people, and we need something that will attract their attention. We need a hook. And then they propose, actually in Spanish, this title, which is the same in English: Affirmed and Hidden Identities, from the Inquisition to the Shoah. And I am using three illustrations here, where you see first, someone being put to death. It could be, I think it's Spain. That's the first illustration that you see at the left of your screen, and it's put to death certainly because of uh, some kind of inquisitorial process, trial. uh, the kind of hat you see was to humiliate them. I mean, this pointy hat that they used, particularly when they were you know um, persecuting Jews on other kind of heretics, let's say, or crypto Jews. And as you can see here, these people is being tortured and put to death, not with the traditional bonfire, but with a very Spanish instrument called garrote vil. I don't know how to translate that into English, but that was it's a typical instrument of death. I mean, of death penalty from Spain, and actually they used that until recently. I mean, the garrote bill was used in Spain during the Franco dictatorship, to put people to death. The
Like
second,
guillotine,
sorry,
like guillotine, like guillotine.
it wasn't the guillotine. It's even, I think, worse than the guillotine. I won't give you the detail, but the Spanish, in general, they were very refined in terms of torture and this kind of things. I mean, actually, if you go to, I think it's Cordoba or Seville, you can visit the Museum of Torture there, and they will show you all the instruments that the Inquisition used to torture people and to get confessions and that kind of thing. The second one is Spinoza, the big philosopher, and I'm gonna come back to Spinoza in this presentation because I think he represents the summum, if you want, the highest of the split mind. And I'm going to explain what I mean by that. And the third one is a more recent case. What you see there is the identity card that was used by someone called Hans Neumann to survive the Shoah. He was born in Prague, uh, and then he assumed this false identity, Jan Sevesta, as you can read there, maybe, in order to travel to Berlin and work for the Nazis and survive then the Shoah. What I'm going to present today, it's not really original. I will say that this is based on the ideas, on the research of other historians, of other philosophers, and it's based on my readings that I call readings about liminal identities, marginal identities, identities that are not at the center, but are always at the periphery. And unfortunately, the first reference is just in Spanish. I have it here, but you can see it also there in the screen. It's from an Argentinian Venezuelan psychoanalyst called Fernando Jurman, who now is living in Israel now. And he wrote this book called Fantasmas Precursores. You can call this in English is kind of the, I don't know, I mean, those those ghosts who preceded something. Precursores is referred to someone who preceded something, who kind of did something preceding a big event. And in this case, the notion of precursores in Spanish is referred to those who fought for the Republican and the idea of independence of South America from the Spanish Empire. I mean, this idea of the precursores, we have a big name who was considered a precursor. You know, I don't know how, maybe Eddie can help me with the translation. But the idea of a precursor is someone who it's in the vanguard, who is bringing new ideas. And we have a big name, for example, in Venezuela, for those who know a little bit about the history of Venezuela, we consider Francisco de Miranda one of the precursors of the independence of not only Venezuela, but of the entire South America. And the thesis of Fernando Jurman is that these precursores, these either civilian figures or military figures, because Miranda combined both. He fought in the French Revolution in France. You can, if you go to the Arc du Triomphe in Paris, then you will see his name engraved in the arc, because he fought in the French Revolution. He fought in the American Revolution against the. Yes, if you can, sorry, someone has a mic open. Lillian, if you can mute your mic, please. Okay, thank you. Yeah, I'm still getting the feedback. I think we should have Lillian, if you can mute your mic, or someone else.
Trying.
Yeah, I'm getting a feedback. Okay, thank you. Well, and then you have Miranda being one of the, I mean, he fought in the American Revolution also, and then he came to Venezuela and brought these ideas to Venezuela. But the thesis of Jurman is that some of these figures, the big figures, either civilian figures or military figures in the process of independence of South America, they were descendants of crypto-Jews. And it seems that was the case. There is this hypothesis that Miranda was one of them. And then he tries to answer why these descendants of crypto-Jews were so inclined to, to fight Spain and to fight the monarchy and to fight for the independence and to, to create these new republics in South America. And the thesis of Jurman is that they suffer a trauma. And that's because of that trauma, they decided to assume these very, let's say, revolutionary ideas. These ideas against the establishment, if you want. And I'm going to translate briefly from the book here. He asked himself why the conversos, why these crypto Jews had some kind of unity. They had some kind of, let's say, they were kind of united by the fact that they were crypto Jews. But why they were so close? Why they tend to identify to each other? I mean, even if you, for example, if you think about the Portuguese Jewish community, those who came from Spain first to Portugal, and then they were expelled from Portugal and went to different countries, England, as in the case of Spinoza's family, to the Netherlands, and they also went to New York, and also to Curacao in the Caribbean, etc. They called themselves the Nação in Portuguese. The Nação means the nation. They tend to identify themselves, was a kind of a code language. They called themselves the Nação. We are part of the nation. And according to, and they were, some of them were crypto Jews who came back to Judaism. But then Jurman asked himself why they were united, why they have this, and they say they were united not because of the religion, but they were united because of the trauma, because of that lived experience that they have. And based on this notion, he explained the role of these crypto Jews or descendant of crypto Jews in the independence and the foundation of the South American Republic. The second source is a classical work by the Israeli historian Yirmiyahu Yovel called Spinoza and Other Heretics. And he called Spinoza the Marrano of Reason. Actually, this book is not just about Spinoza, as you're going to see in a moment. It's about other heretics who also embody this notion of the split mind and contributed to modernity, not only in philosophy, in literature, in politics. I mean, the thesis of Yovel is that we cannot understand modernity as, this idea that tradition should be put away, that we should make a clear distinction between the church and the state, that we should protect liberties, including liberty, freedom of religion, freedom of speech. What Yovel says is that there is no way you can understand the very notion of modernity without understanding the role of the crypto Jews and the Marranos in different fields. In philosophy, which is the case of Baruch Spinoza, but also in literature, in politics, etc. And then the third reference that I read, is a very interesting book, and maybe some of you may remember him, of a friend called Ariel Segal. Ariel Segal is a historian. He lives now in Peru, but he wrote a very interesting book about study he made about the Jews of the Amazon, meaning these, let's say, it's depending how you define who is a Jew, which is also a big question, but the descendants of Moroccan Jews, mainly from Tetuan, who settled in the beginning of the 20th century in Iquitos, in the Peruvian Amazonian jungle, because of the caoutchouc business, but how do you say rubber? Because of the rubber business, as they did also, as my great grandfather Sam Laredo did when he went to Manaus in Brazil. And then this is a very interesting study, because you see that this question of crypto Judaism or liminal identities, it's very contemporary. It's very attached to to the current life of people, not only in Iquitos, but in many other regions and communities worldwide, as I'm going to show you in a moment. The premise of my lecture is that even if we think that remembering is the core value of Judaism, I will say that also forgetting, it's very meaningful. And that there is always in the history of the Jewish people a big tension, if you want, between remembering and forgetting. And then you see there Freud, because, I mean, certainly Freud made a lot of contribution to understand why people forget. And certainly for him, people forget because they don't want to remember. They don't want to relive something that traumatized them, that was painful. and then he proposed a system, a method in order to deal with that. Is okay, but then you will have to face those memories, then you will have to talk about them, and eventually then you will be able to become the trauma. And then as I said before, the option of assimilating to stop being Jew is not new. I think it has been there since the beginning, let's say since Abraham. But now the issue is a little bit different, because we are living times of what I call fluid identities. What that means, I mean, fluid identity means that you can be whatever you want, that you don't need someone to tell you what you want. Even though, yes, I mean, we have the halakha and we have all the institutions and the procedures and the rabbinical courts and everything, but at the end, we are living in times where people tend to identify first and foremost because they want to identify for whatever reason. And then I'm using here the case, and I'm going to come back to this case of those who suddenly, people who never, were identified as Jews. They didn't have a clue about what was to be Sephardic. They suddenly, because in Spain, the government decided to pass a law to allow people of Sephardic origins to get the Spanish citizenship. Then suddenly they decided that, yes, that they had Sephardic origins in order to claim that citizenship. Or even, as I'm going to show you in a moment, those who discover their Jewish past that their parents tried to bury, particularly because of the Shoah. And then what we are seeing is that the options of how to forget or how to remember Judaism are multiplying. Again, in a world where everything it's being redefined. Okay, I think Alfredo, if you can mute your mic, please. And then my question, okay, if to forget and to remember, they are both part of the Jewish identity, then what that means for the future of the Jewish people in Israel and also outside Israel. And certainly in times with everything, it's very liquid, very fluid. I mean, genders, ethnicity, ethnos, the nation, the very idea of nation, or even the very idea of the family. And then I see a long way, and then, I dated this in 1391. I'm going to explain you why, and then until 2021. But I could have, go even back to the ancient history of the Jewish people, and then I will find examples of the same pattern over and over repeating itself. 1391, you will see certainly the situation, the country, the history, the context were different, but then you will see some similarities, some patterns repeating over and over. For example, in 1933, etc., etc. Well, why 1391? Why I selected this year as the beginning of my analysis? In 1391, the Jews from Seville in Spain suffered a big pogrom. Some of them were killed during that pogrom. Some of them left Spain to go to Algeria, not Morocco. Most of them settled in Algeria. Then you had, maybe that's why I had family. My great grandmother, Luna, trying to remember her last name. Okay, Why, now I forgot her last name. She was from Oran, and then she moved to Tetuan from Oran. Maybe that's why she was maybe a descendant of those Jews who left Seville in 1391. But something happened. Some Jews, after this big pogrom in Seville, they converted to Catholicism. And then we can say that this conversion also brought the first wave of crypto Jews. Then we can say that 13, it's not exactly that day, but in terms of, a big group of Spanish Jews converting to Catholicism took place for the first time after the Seville massacre in 1391. The other day that it's also very important, because it's somewhat a consequence of 1391, is 1478, because that was the creation of the Inquisition, of the Spanish Inquisition. And why one of the goals, one of the objectives of the Spanish Inquisition was to look for those who were judaizantes, as we say in Spanish, those who were practicing, even though they converted and they claimed that they were good Catholics, they were still practicing Jewish rituals. And then one of the things that the Inquisition wanted to achieve is to go after them and certainly also send a message to the other conversos to say, okay, well, you should be careful, because if you are not sincere, then you can be burned, and certainly we are going to dispossess you of everything, etc., all the consequences of being prosecuted by the Inquisition. The other big moment, I would say, of it's certainly the expulsion of Poles from Spain in 1492, and then from Portugal 5 years later in 1497. Not exactly the same modus operandi, because in the case of Spain, I think you are, maybe all of you or most of you are familiar with what happened there, is that the Catholic, queen and king, Fernando, Isabel, they decided that, the Jews should be expelled from Spain. I mean, they were in the process of reunifying Spain after winning the last big battle in Granada against the Moors. And then I won't go into all the reasons, but then they decided to expel. I mean, actually, they gave the option to the Jews. Either you convert and you can stay, or you can go. And I don't know if you're familiar with that, but the majority decided to stay and convert. And it was a minority, just a minority, who decided to leave Spain and then go to Morocco, North Africa, the Ottoman Empire, and some of them also went to the Americas, etc. And then in Portugal, the king did things a little bit different. He actually performed a mass conversion of the Jews. You are all converted, particularly your children. All of them are Catholic, because, with a little bit of water, holy water, whatever, you are all converted. Some of the Jews decided to leave, even though they were, according to the king and the church, converted, and some others stay in Portugal. And then what we can see here is really a growing movement of crypto Jews, of Marranos, both in Spain and Portugal. Then, well, certainly you have all the issues related to the crypto Jews who were persecuted in Spain, burned, tortured, garrote vil, whatever, and the influence that this split mind had in the Portuguese and the Spanish culture, as I'm going to show you in a moment. But also you had other things taking place outside Spain and Portugal. In 1656, a man from Turkey, I think he was from Smyrna, he declared himself that he was the Mashiach, the Messiah. It was Shoah Tzvi. And that certainly caused a big, that the fact, that was under the influence of another person, Nathan from Gaza, who was the prophet, let's say, playing the role of Eliyahu and Navi, of Elias the prophet. Shoah Tzvi announced publicly that he was the Messiah. But not only he announced that he was the Messiah, he said, now all the Jews, wherever they are, we should move to Israel. We should go back to Eretz Israel. And that has a big impact in all the Jewish communities worldwide. Not only in the Sephardi community in Turkey or in the Ottoman Empire, also in Poland, in part of Russia, in Ukraine. The Jews were, we have been waiting, for the Mashiach many years. And then after the catastrophe in Spain and Portugal, after also, the Jews in Poland, they were very poor. They were also persecuted, etc., etc. They were kind of very hopeful. They said, okay, finally we'll see the redemption. But the problem with this, you can read certainly what I recommend if you want to understand the role of Shoah Tzvi, his role as a false Messiah. I recommend the reading of his biography by Gershon Scholem. But the question with this false Messiah is that in 1666, the Sultan of the Ottoman Empire arrested him and said, okay, we are going to stop this madness. And you have two options. Either you convert to Islam or we'll kill you, we'll execute you. And then he converted to Islam. And the followers of Shoah Tzvi, a group of followers, they also converted. Based on the idea that, he was not really converting. He was also playing the game of a crypto Jew. In this case, not as a Catholic, but as a Muslim. And this is also a very important moment to understand this. And I'm going to come back later, this notion of the split mind in Judaism. Then there are other, very important dates and years, but then let's move forward to, the 20th century, the rise of Nazism in Germany, and all that followed that in terms of the wave of anti-Semitism, and then the Shoah between 1933 and 1945. Certainly that event, that certainly it's one of the most tragic event in the history of the Jewish people, but also had a big impact in terms of the Jewish consciousness, of the Jewish mind. First, because, as we are going to see later on, some Jews live under the illusion that because they assimilated to the European cultures, they were somewhat protected from persecution. The idea of, the emancipation of the Jews that started with Napoleon in France, and then from France, then in Germany and other countries, created this illusion. If we are assimilated, if we become more French and more German and more maybe Polish, not Poland was a little bit different, but in Austria also, and they were very, I was the other day listening to a lecture by a historian, and he said, the Jews in Germany and in Austria, they fought in the First World War. They enlisted in the case of Austria in the imperial army, because they felt that they had that duty, to defend the Austro-Hungarian Empire or the German nation, because they felt that they were German or Austrian, and that had that obligation. And the question is that then we had the Nazism and the Shoah, and then, okay, well, that doesn't work. You assimilated, you became German, you became Austrian, you became Hungarian, but that didn't help you. That didn't prevent you from being killed and persecuted. And then we'll see how this reflects today, even in 2021. I'm going to show you one particular case. Okay, well, we agree that Judaism is the consciousness of remembering. What you see there is a tattoo with the word Zahor. And I use this photo particularly because it's a little bit shocking. I mean, you know that according to the Halakha, we are not supposed to do any kind of cutting on the skin or tattooing anything on the skin. I mean, because, that was a common practice among maybe the Egyptians and among other pagan cultures. Then we were, that was forbidden that is forbidden actually by the Halakha. But then you have this image, because what I would like to highlight here is the fact that remembering for us, meaning Zahor, is not just a question of consciousness. It's really inscribed in the body. For the males, as we are going to see in a moment, that's very obvious. That I think that's clear, that is inscribed in the body. But also in general, I mean, the idea of, remembering because it's something that you embody and not only something that you think. I mean, all the practice of Judaism, of the Halakha, of eating in a certain way, of eating certain things, of doing certain things, of praying in a certain way, is about embodying this remembering. It's not just about thinking about it. It's not just, remembering because, I have a certain image in my mind, because I have a certain memory, but it's really about remembering with the body. And I think that's why this photo is so clear in conveying this idea, even though it's a little bit shocking, because it goes against the prescription of not having tattoos. Certainly, remembering, it's everywhere. We know, keep and remember the Shabbat in the prayer, and then the celebration of Passover as a memorial. In Exodus, we have here the big quote. I won't read the big quote. But certainly remembering our enemies. You shall remember what Amalek did to you, etc. And certainly this idea of please don't forget. I mean, if I forget you, then as in the Tehillim, in the Psalm, if I forget you, O Jerusalem, may my right hand forget its skill, may my tongue cling to my palate if I don't remember you, etc. Remembering its key has been there since ever, but also forgetting. That's my thesis. And certainly not as a good thing. Forgetting as abandoning, as leaving Judaism. And then we have many places where God, Hashem, say, you have forgotten the Torah of your God. In this, for example, quote from the prophet Hosea, or the case of the Hellenized Jews during the times of the Hashmonaim, of the Maccabees. And this is a very interesting, and that's why I'm going to come back to this question of the circumcision, because Spinoza actually refers to that. What we see here, even though the Maccabees book are not part, as in our case, in the Jewish tradition, are not part of the Tanakh, of the Jewish canon, but still it's considered a very important document, because it's considered really a historical document, telling what happened during the times of the Hashmonaim and the Hellenized conquerors of Eretz Israel, and they adopted the customs of the Greeks, the Gentile, according to this translation, the Gentile customs, and remove the marks of circumcision. How can you remove that? By, with some skins, adding what was missing. Meaning going to this, trying to forget by removing this particularly mark that was key to remember who they were. And I'm going to come back. But then you have I think the most elaborated idea of forgetting about being Jew by Paul, a Pharisee, a Jew, who, according to the Christian tradition, had this vision in the way to Damascus. And then in Galatians says, now forget about being Jew or Greek. I mean, there is neither Jew nor Greek, neither slave nor free. There is no male, female. There is no distinction to be made, because now we have a new savior, etc., etc. Meaning that since ever, we had this dialectic between forgetting and remembering. Always in the Jewish history. The question is that more recently, this issue of forgetting created a way to convey certain things. That's the thesis of the philosopher Leo Strauss, who said in his book, Persecution and the Art of Writing, is that persecutions give birth to a particular way of conveying idea, and mainly about, conveying through writing and certain literary techniques, where the truth about crucial issues is presented exclusively between the lines. You don't talk about certain things openly. You use some kind of code to convey this, and whoever is trying to convey these ideas between the lines, he's addressing this to certain readers, to a certain public who will be able to understand what this person is trying to say. And according to Strauss, these readers are intelligent. Okay, they are able to decode, to understand what these people are trying to say. But particularly, he used the word trustworthy readers. You can trust them. Why you can trust them? Because they won't denounce you. They will understand the message. They will get it. But because they are part of the same community of persecuted people, they will keep the secret. And this will give birth to a particular way of conveying certain things. In his book, Strauss, he analyzes basically two big philosophers. One is the Rambam, Maimonides, and particularly the Guide of the Perplexed, the Moreh Nebuchim. Why? Because he says, first, certainly Maimonides was aware of, he himself was a subject of persecution. We should remember he was born in Spain, in Cordoba, in Cordoba, and then he fled with his father, I think, to Fez, Morocco, and then he left Morocco and went to Egypt, etc. And then he was briefly in Eretz Israel and came back to Fostat when he settled himself in Egypt, in what is now Cairo. But the thesis of Strauss is that Maimonides, he had to convey certain things in a way that won't offend the sensibilities of the majority, in his case, the Muslim scholars and religious leaders, but also the sensibilities of other Jews. Then, and according, that's the thesis of Strauss, the Guide of a Perplexed is exactly an exercise of this coding way of conveying ideas. And the other example is Spinoza, and we are going to come back to this question. Okay, well, the expulsion, I already talked about that. Just, I would like to highlight how this notion of conveying certain things somewhat was clear for the Jews or the crypto Jews who remain in Spain and Portugal. And particularly, I have a picture here of a small town in Portugal called Belmonte. And Belmonte was mainly, the inhabitants, the people living in Belmonte, actually, even now, they were crypto Jews. And for hundreds of years, they kept certain practices typical of the crypto Jews, meaning they were performing Jewish rituals, but in their own way. I don't remember who, I think a rabbi in the around 75, 76, went to Belmonte to meet these people and see what they were doing. And the rabbi was there during Passover, during Pesach, and asked them, okay, do you perform the Seder? They said, yes, certainly we perform the Seder. Okay, and then we are going to invite you to our Seder. And they invited the rabbi, and the rabbi noticed something, that they were closing all the windows and covering everything with drapes everywhere. And I said, why you are doing that? Why you are closing all the windows and covering? And, this is part of the celebration. It's part of the prescription for the Seder. You should cover. This is the way our ancestors celebrated Pesach. And then the rabbi kind of tried to find out more about this custom. And the reason behind that is that for them was very dangerous, particularly in previous centuries, to practice openly, their way of doing things, their Judaic practices. And then they assume that, the fact that they were hiding from the outside world when they were celebrating Passover, that was part of the ritual. As you can see, how the meaning of the ritual also changed because of this split mind. I have here 3 very interesting examples of how the split mind manifested itself in Spain, particularly, but also outside Spain. I'm going to start with a piece wrote by a Spanish writer, and it's clear that Fernando de Rojas, the one who wrote this, let's say, comedy called La Celestina in 1499, he was descendant of Jews who converted to Catholicism. And some people in his family, they were persecuted by the Inquisition, etc., etc. But what you can see, and that's the analysis of Yirmiyahu Yovel in his book on Spinoza and other heretics, is that in the case of the Rojas, you see how this split mind tend to manifest itself. And I'm going to show you, I hope you can, this is a translation, it's an adaptation. Certainly in Spanish, I think there is something that it's not easy to translate. But let me find here the quote I would like to share with you to show you how this way of conveying things is expressed by the Rojas. Let me see if I find the quote here. Sorry for the send to. Sorry. Yes, you have a dialogue between Callisto. He's in love with what's her name? Well, with a young lady, and because La Celestina is the one who's trying to do the match, is the shidduch. Let's say that's the role of La Celestina, even though today the word Celestina in Spanish doesn't have a good connotation. That's the role of the Celestina. She's the one trying to doing the shidduch, the matching between Callisto and Melibea. And then he's having a dialogue with Sempronio, who is his servant. But I would like to show you, and I don't see the quote here, but then I'm gonna read it from Yirmiyahu Yovel, because I think this will give you an idea of how the Rojas was trying to convey something that was very common among the crypto Jews. I'm gonna come back to my presentation just to avoid any confusion. You have this dialogue, and Sempronio says to Callisto, "Look, sir, you have been here in the church so long that people are beginning to notice it. They call an overly devout man an hypocrite." Very interesting idea. The idea that sometimes, or most of the time, the crypto Jews, they wanted to show that they were very pious and very attached to the Catholic ritual. But in Spain, being so pious, overly pious, was considered a sign of Judaizante, of practicing in hiding Jewish rituals. And this is one of the dialogue. And the other one, it's also very interesting because they are talking, it's in the same act. They are talking about, all the suffering of Callisto because the love that he feels for Melibea, and then, he cannot fulfill it. And, there is this, all the obstacles, to fulfill his love. But then you see how this code of the split mind of the crypto Jew expressed. And then again, Sempronio, the servant, says to Callisto, "If you have a passion, a malady, suffer it at home. Don't let the world feel it. Don't let strangers guess your trouble, since the tambourine in the hands of those who will know how to play it, the informers, could translate in trouble for you." If you have this suffering, this passion, this malady of the split mind, that you have to shut down the curtains in order to light a candle in Shabbat, or in some way practice some form of seder, or in some form try to be Jewish in hiding, be careful, suffer it at home. That's something that you should hide from the strangers. You see, that's the one way of conveying. And we'll see that not only in Fernando de Rojas, but in other authors. Then the second example that I have here is from the Jews, not only in Spain and Portugal, but also the Jews in Mexico, and particularly in regions of Mexico that are now a part of the United States, like Arizona or New Mexico, Colorado. You know that Jews, again, crypto Jews, they flee Spain during the expulsion or after the expulsion of Portugal. They go to some European countries, to North Africa, to the Ottoman Empire, but some of them went to the Americas. Actually, some of them traveled with Columbus, that we know. One of them, actually, I wrote in my novel about him, was a Halevi who traveled with Columbus and arrived to La Española, etc. And also some of them went to Mexico. But Mexico had a few countries in Latin America had the Inquisition institution. One of them was Mexico. They have a big, let's say, inquisitorial apparatus in Mexico. Another one was Peru, and a small one in what is known, what is today Colombia, in Cartagena, the Indians. And these Jews, or these crypto Jews in Mexico, they adopted Esther, the Esther from the Megillat Purim, from the book of Esther, as their patron saint. As you see here, one of the representations of Esther, the patron saint of the crypto Jews, from the Jews of, I think, in one of the states in the US, it could be New Mexico. And it's very interesting why Esther became the patron saint of these crypto Jews. If you go to the book of Esther, and I hope I'm going to find the quote now, there is something very interesting. First, Mordecai, I don't know, we can say the uncle. I mean, that's also a little bit complicated, but I won't go there. But Mordecai says to Esther, first, you shouldn't reveal your true identity to anyone, nor to the king. I mean, when she presented herself, in front of the king of Ahasuerus, she never disclosed that she was Jewish. And actually, Mordecai told her that. That's one thing. Then you see an element, certainly, of crypto Judaism. I mean, you don't reveal your true identity because that will get you in trouble. That's the first thing that Mordecai says to her. But then after that, they have a dialogue. This is a very interesting dialogue between them, because now Mordecai, through I think one of the eunuchos, I don't know how you say that, one of the servants of the harem, they have a dialogue. And let me see if I can find here, because it's a very interesting dialogue also. In terms of, okay, you are doing this, Mordecai says to Esther, because you have a mission. And your mission is to save the Jews. But you are not disclosing your identity. But let me see if I find. Okay, well, there is a reference to that, but unfortunately, I cannot find the exact quotation. He says to Esther, okay, yes, I mean, you are hiding your identity. And because of that, you will be able eventually to perform your mission, which is to save the Jews. But do not imagine to yourself that because you are hiding your identity, you will escape in the king's house from among all the Jews. For if, okay, here I have the quote. And this is very interesting. I mean, we are talking about, I don't know exactly when the book of Esther, was written, but you see something that it's very current, and particularly if we think about the history of the Shoah. For if you remain silent at this time, meaning if you don't disclose your identity, relief and rescue will arise for the Jews from elsewhere, and you and your father's household will perish. And who knows whether at a time like this you will attain the kingdom. Meaning, even if you don't disclose your identity, don't think that you will be somewhat protected. And you are doing this because you are performing this mission. And that's why these crypto Jews in New Mexico or Colorado, wherever, they adopted Esther because they saw in Esther the paradigm of this crypto Jew performing a mission in hiding, in not revealing her identity, but also being very conscious that also she was in trouble, even though she didn't reveal her identity. And then finally, I have another example of this manifestation of the split mind in Don Quixote by Cervantes. First, I should say, there have been a lot of debate about the ancestors of Miguel de Cervantes. The Spanish authors, the historians, they don't like the idea that Cervantes was the descendant of crypto Jews or Jews. But my brother-in-law, I mean, he did a very fine research, and actually he published a paper recently proving with no doubt that Miguel de Cervantes was the descendant of Jews who converted to Catholicism. That there is no doubt. I mean, according to all the documents and everything, that doesn't mean that he was a Jew or a crypto Jew, Cervantes, but it's clear that he was a descendant of Jews who converted in 13. I don't have exactly the date, but around 1340 something, from his father's side, these people converted to Judaism. They were crypto Jews, we don't know. But what we know is that when you read carefully the novel, Don Quixote, there are many references to Judaism. And that has been studied for, by many people, many scholars, etc. But there is one particular reference that is quite interesting and revealing. There is a story in Nedarim, in the Talmud, in the treatise of Nedarim. I'm going to find here the reference. It's called in Aramaic the story of. Okay, I'm going to find the reference. Sorry about that. Nedarim. It's called the story of, because the word is very important, Kanya de Rava. Kanya in Aramaic, Kanya de Rava. Rava's cane. And it's a situation where you have two men, going to see the rabbinical court because one was claiming that he lent some money to the other one and the other one hasn't repaid that money to him. And the one, who owes the money to the other one, he arrived to the court, to the rabbinical court, with a cane. And then one of the rabbis asked him, okay, did you pay? I mean, the way he phrased the question is, do you have the money that you owe to this guy? And then you will have to make an oath, with a Sefer Torah. And then what this man does, he gave the cane to someone else, take the Sefer Torah, and then he says, no, by the law, by the Torah, I say firmly that I don't have that money with me. I don't have that money with me. Certainly, he didn't have the money because the money was contained in the cane, and every time that he was making the oath, he was giving the cane to another person. And you have exactly the same story in Don Quixote. When Sancho Panza became the governor of an island called Barataria, and then he faces exactly the same situation. Two men arrive to him. He's the judge, he's the governor of that island. And then he has to decide the case. And instead of the Sefer Torah, he makes these men to make an oath. And he gave him a crucifix and said, okay, now, and then he does exactly the same. He takes the cane and gives the cane to another person, and he takes the crucifix and say, no, I don't have that money with me, etc. And at the end, as in the case in Nedarim, then the rabbi say, okay, break the cane, and the money falls down. And exactly the same thing Sancho Panza does in his judgment. He says, break the cane because the money is inside the cane. And then again, we can go back to Leo Strauss, thesis about persecution at the art of writing, or the art of conveying, of communicating in a certain code. And we see in these three cases how this is manifested clearly. In the case of La Celestina, in the case of Saint Esther becoming the patron saint of the crypto Jews, because she was able to hide her identity and then perform her mission. And then in the case of this particular story in the novel Don Quixote. But certainly this question of the split man, of a split mind, had very tragic consequences. Then I'm going to go back briefly to Shabbatai Tzvi, because certainly it created a big trauma among the people who believe in him. I mean, I won't go into the details, but the way, the Shabbatai Tzvi understood the notion of redemption was very weird, because he was really, when he was when he declared that he was the Messiah, he transgressed the halakha, the Jewish law. But people still believe in him, even though he was performing these very weird rituals, even going against the Jewish law. But then it has a huge consequence when he decided then to convert, or he was forced, if you want, to convert to Islam, create a big frustration and a big, people was really, let's say, not only traumatized, I will say, they were, I'm forgetting my words now in English. But then you have a second episode in Poland, when you have a second false Messiah claiming that he was the reincarnation of Shabbatai Tzvi, later on, Jacob Frank. And this is even more troubling as a case, in the case of Jacob Frank, because in this case, first, he was also in the same line of Tzvi. I mean, the idea of bringing redemption by Averah, by sin, by sinning in all the ways that you can imagine. It was, and then there is an element of Kabbalah, of mysticism behind that, because in order to redeem the impurities, the kelipot, then the Mashiach, the Messiah, should go deep down, and in this impure words in order to redeem what it still is. You have a certain element of a spirituality, of godliness in this kelipot, in these impurities, and then by performing all these sins, he was able to redeem. Well, it's a very weird thing. I'm not an expert in that area, but that's mainly the claim of Zvi and then of Jacob Frank. And the thing with Frank is that then he first converted Christianity in Poland. And then, no, first he converted, to Islam. And then finally he converted to Christianity. And then you have a sect, coming out called the Frankists. That was the leader of that sect was the daughter of Frank. But there is something interesting, and I'm not an expert again, but if you read Gershon Scholem and others, in both cases, particularly in the case of Zvi, this frustration, let's say, caused by Zvi and Frank, was somewhat very influential in the birth of Hasidism. Because they, and particularly Shabbatai Tzvi, maybe not as much Frank, but they had a huge impact in the Jewish masses. We are not talking just about the scholars, the rabbis, the learned people. If you think about, Poland, Russia, Ukraine, you're talking about mostly poor Jews who live very hard lives, who were persecuted, who were humiliated. And, they were waiting for the Mashiach because it was their saviors in a very concrete way. I mean, to improve their lives, to, come out of this persecution, humiliation, etc. And because of that fervor, of that popular fervor, then you had a very important figure, the Baal Shem Tov, who was able to channel, let's say, that fervor and gave birth to the movement of Hasidim, to a very popular movement of Hasidism, and then that is still very well alive today. And I think you have always this duality, again, of forgetting and remembering. In the case of Zvi or Frank, certainly at the end, either they were forced. In the case of Frank, maybe also he was a little bit unstable. I don't know. But they and their followers, certainly a minority, they decided to forget, to cut all the ties with, at least in appearance, at least externally, to cut all the ties with Judaism. But that tension that they created among Jews, particularly in Europe, gave birth to this very important movement of Jewish revival that is called Hasidism. And then you have Spinoza, the other case that it's also very interesting. As you know, Spinoza was expelled from the Spanish, Portuguese Jewish community of Amsterdam. He was expelled. Actually, he was the subject of what is called in Hebrew a cherem when he was very young. I think he was 20 years old. He went to the cheder, he went to the yeshiva, he knew about, he spoke Hebrew. Actually, he wrote a Hebrew grammar. He was very learned in Tanakh. It seems that also in Talmud, and some others even say that he knew about Kabbalah, but that's not clear. But when he was 20, he was expelled by the leaders of the community, the rabbis, but also the community leaders. At that time, he hasn't published anything. anything. He hasn't published any of his books. For example, he wrote a book about Descartes, the philosopher, criticizing Descartes. He wrote another book about trying to translate from Spanish. Certainly, the theological political treatise, he wrote that many years after his expulsion from the community. The Ethics is a posthumous book that was published after his death, and certainly, he didn't at least as he wasn't a public figure at all. He was not recognized at that time as a big philosopher. He became, recognized by others like Leibniz as one of the big philosophers of his time. But when he was expelled, he was not known at all. Then why the herem? Why he was expelled? It seemed that he was connected to certain Christian groups, but kind of liberal Christians. And these Christians, they were very critical in the way they look at the Bible and the way they look at religious institutions. And maybe because of that, these relations that he had with these Christians, then he was expelled by the Jewish community, from the Jewish community. And then he cut all the links with the Jewish community. I mean, he didn't convert to any other religion. And he actually became very critical of all religions, and in the theological political treatise of the Jewish religion. I mean, his claim basically is that Moshe was a political leader, that the main objective of the Torah, of the Jewish law, was to create a constitution for the Jewish people in order to create the conditions of governance of the Jewish nation and the Jewish state in Israel, in Eretz Israel, and that there is nothing that can be said in terms of divine revelation or prophecy or anything. Actually, he dismissed prophecy as being less, let's say, intellectually less elaborating, because it was based on imagination, etc. Well, it's basically a criticism of religion, and particularly of the Jewish religion. But then, in the same book, where he's criticizing, the notion that the Torah was revealed and the Moses received the Torah in Sinai from God and all this, he says something that it's quite interesting. He talks about the sign of circumcision. And then you have the quote here. The sign of circumcision is so important in this matter of Jewish identity and the preservation of the Jewish people that I'm convinced that this one thing will preserve the Jewish nation forever. Indeed, in the foundation of their religion hasn't sapped their courage. And then it's very interesting. I would be perfectly sure that someday, given the opportunity, they would set up their state again, and God would choose them all over again. Two things very interesting. When he tried to explain what the Jews have survived, say this is not just a question of being aware, of being conscious of the mind of the Jews. This is a question of the body, of the inscription of that mark in the male Jewish body. That's the main thing that he points out. This is very interesting. And then if you understand a little bit, I mean, it's very hard to read. It's not easy. Spinoza, it's quite complex and to read, because it's very dry when you read the ethics. I mean, it's very dry. It's a very dry language. But if you understand a little bit about the philosophy of Spinoza says there is no distinction between mind and body. I mean, this is the first criticism of Descartes. I mean, the idea of cogito ergo sum of Descartes, he said, no. I mean, it's not because of cogito. It's not because of the mind that I am. It's because I am a mind and a body. And they are both the same thing. Okay, I won't go into the philosophical discussion. But it's very important that he thinks about the survival of the Jewish people in terms of the embodiment of the mark, of the circumcision. You know, that's why when I show you the quote from the Hellenized Jews during the time of the Ashmonaim, you know, the question of the circumcision was also key, but in the opposite way. You know, they were trying to forget by getting rid of the circumcision. But then Spinoza, and I don't know if he had in mind that story of the Hellenized Jews, but he said, you know what, it kept you as a people, the circumcision. But then in the same paragraph, he says something that it's very weird. Because remember, this theological political treatise is about dismissing the idea of God giving the Torah to the people or choosing the people. What he says is, no, this is about Moshe being a legislator and creating a constitution for a people. That's it. But now he says, and if certainly he's still criticizing the religion, because he says, if the foundations of the religion, meaning for him the superstition, hadn't sapped their courage, if still they have some courage, given the opportunity, they would set up their state again. I mean, this is like Herzl, Theodor Herzl, writing the Jewish state in the 17th century. And then there is this weird religious reference, and God would choose them all over again. You know, one way to read this, as Jovel does, is he was conveying this to someone who, as Strauss said, was able to understand what Spinoza was saying. Certainly, he was very careful, for example, when he talked in the book, when he wrote about the Christian religion. Actually, he gives a very positive outlook of the Christian religion in general, even though he criticized also Christianism as being a superstition. He's very careful. Why? Certainly because he was aware that he was surrounded by Christians and he didn't want to get in trouble. And actually, he never published any of his book with his name. The Ethics was published after he passed away with no name. And the other book, this one also. But still, being the descendant of crypto-Jews who came back to Judaism after fleeing Portugal, he was very aware of the dangers of conveying things openly. But here, he's saying something that is quite strong. It's just a paragraph, quickly towards the end of the treatise. But then he's conveying this to someone who will be able to understand what he's trying to say. And there have been a lot of debate about this particular quote from Spinoza. Okay, let me then arrive to 2021. And again, the pattern. The same pattern of trying to forget, trying to hide your identity, but I call this the useless exercise of forgetting. This is about the story of a Jew, Hans Neumann, who was born in Prague. And then his parents were deported first to, what's the name of the camp nearby nearby Prague? If you remember, what's the name of that camp? Okay, well, their parents first, his mom and then his dad, they were deported to this camp nearby Prague that was used by the Nazis to say that they were treating well the Jews, etc. Well, what's the name of that camp? Okay, sorry. Theresienstadt, thank you. And then both of them were deported to Auschwitz, as was the case of some other members of his family. But Hans and his brother Lothar, they survived the war. In the case of Hans, that it was not clear how he survived the war. In the case of the brother Lothar, okay, it's a little bit, it's a long story because they have a paint factory in Prague. The Nazis took over the paint factory called Montana in Prague, and then Lothar was the manager while the Nazis controlled the paint factory, but Lothar was the manager. And then at some point, the Nazis decided to deport all the Jews from Prague. Lothar went into hiding, and then Hans left and went to Berlin. The question is that these two brothers who survived the war, they in 1948 they moved to Venezuela. They first went to Austria, to Vienna, then to Paris, and in Paris they met someone who told them, Venezuela, it's looking for migrants, European migrants. They are offering, good conditions, etc., etc. I think it could be a good place. I can arrange you a meeting with the Venezuelan consul in Paris. They met the consul, and then they moved to Venezuela. They created an empire, a business empire. They recreated the Montana paint factory in Venezuela. After Montana became a big corporation, and Hans Neumann, his brother retired very early and moved to Switzerland, but then he became the CEO of the corporation, became a very rich man, a philanthropist. He was very close to the culture in Venezuela. He founded newspapers. He created the first newspaper in English in Venezuela, their daily journal. He created other newspapers, etc. He was very well known in Venezuela. But he never identified himself as a Jew. Never. Actually, there is a story that the Ashkenaz community, I think they were building a new Jewish school in Caracas, and they approached Neumann, who was already a very rich man, for a donation for this project. And he said to them, and this is documented, why are you asking me a donation? I'm not Jew. Why are you approaching me? And he completely dismissed them. He wore a crucifix, and then his daughter clarified why, but and one Venezuelan woman, a Jewish, Sofia Imber, was a well-known, Eddie Ramirez should remember her, well-known journalist, and also she was the director of one of the biggest museums in Caracas. She was very close to Neumann. And she said once, Hans, okay, I understand that you don't want to identify as a Jew, but why the crucifix? Come on. That's not right. But he never identified himself as a Jew. He married twice. In his second marriage, from his second marriage, he has a daughter, Ariana. And Ariana wrote a book that I have here with me that I read. It's very interesting. When Time Stopped, a memoir of my father's war and what remains. And the interesting thing about this book, it's kind of almost the work of a detective, because the question was for Ariana, who was my father? He never identified himself as a Jew. Ariana went to college in the States. And while she was in college in the States, a Mexican guy, approached her and say, Ariana Neumann? Yes, Neumann. Oh, Neumann, then you should be Jewish. No, I'm not Jewish. Well, certainly Neumann is a Jewish name. The guy was from Mexico, and he says to her, we should be the only two Latino Jews in this college. The first thing that she does, she calls Hans Neumann, her father in Caracas, and she says, that it's true that you are Jewish, that we are Jewish. And he says, don't repeat ever this. We are not Jewish. We are not Jewish. He was very mad when she said that to him. Well, the question is that she started making her inquiry. She start making her research. She goes to Prague, and it seems that in the synagogue in Prague, there is a big wall where you have all the names of the Jews from Prague who were deported and killed by the Nazis. And then she saw the name of her grandmother, the name with their birth date and the date that supposedly they were killed. They were, killed in Auschwitz. No? Then she sees, I forgot the name, Ella and Otto Neumann, And then when she sees the name of her father there, she sees Hans Neumann, the date, the year of birth, and an interrogation sign. And she comes back to Caracas and says, okay, that why you are in this world, I don't want to talk about it. I don't want to tell you anything about it. Again, this idea of forgetting. But this is an useless exercise. This man, he was very ill. He got a couple of strokes. He was very ill. He passed away. Ariana at that time was living in London. She returns to Venezuela for the funeral and everything. And then the lady, I think was the secretary of Hans Neumann, a lady who worked with him in his corporation, told her, your father left a box. He told me that you can find this box in one closet in their house. Go and check the box. He told me that he wanted you to have that box. In the box, she found this document, which is this, as you can see, carte d'identité postale, an ID card, with the picture of her father, Jan Sevesta, with the name Jan Sevesta. He acquired that card. He paid, I think, for that card. He was a chemist, and then he went to Berlin and worked for the Nazis in a paint factory that was used to do the painting for the Nazi planes and the bombs. All the let's say the coating of the planes and the bombs. And then he He was very involved in developing certain kind of coding for, as you can see, I mean, he survived the war. He worked, I think, 2 years in Berlin for that particular. It's a very known brand. Actually, it still exists, but it was entirely consecrated to making this coding for the military equipment of the Nazis. He returned to Prague. He finds out that, unfortunately, his parents were, killed in Auschwitz, and then he decided to move to Venezuela. And then he leaves not only this ID card that you see there, then you see Hans with Ariana, but he writes the entire story. It's a confession. It's a vidui, if you want. He writes everything in Spanish. And this is very interesting because they went back when, communism fell in Czechoslovakia, and then, Václav Havel became president. He was invited to Prague, to come back to Prague. And he was honored by the government. He was received by Václav Havel as, this, Czech Venezuelan who became very successful, etc., etc. And two things. One, he never spoke with anyone in Czech. He didn't want, he spoke certainly Czech perfectly. He never spoke, she tells that story, Czech with anyone. Everything was in English through an interpreter. Quite interesting thing, no? And the second thing is that he gave a speech. He was invited to a banquet because he received, I don't know, some kind of decoration, something. And he said to the Czechs, in front of them, I don't consider myself Czech. I'm Venezuelan. When he gave this speech, you are invited to a banquet. You are welcome as a Czech coming back to your country. And he had the chutzpah of saying these people, I don't consider myself Czech. I'm Venezuelan. But interestingly, he revealed the entire story in this letter that he wrote for Ariana, that he left in the box. Meaning that, yes, you have again this idea that you can forget who you are, that you can put aside all these experiences, that you can assimilate. His family was very assimilated to Czechoslovakia. But at the end, he couldn't forget. And that's why he left the box. And it's really a very good book, and I really recommend the book. But then finally, I know it has been a little bit long, but just what this means today. What this means, this question of forgetting and remembering. I think, again, I'm coming back to this idea. We are living a time of fluid identities or liquid identities, meaning that sometimes you have these very unusual Jews, like Nissim Black, a rapper, an American rapper, who didn't have any connection with Judaism at all. And then he decided to become a Hasidic Jew, a Haredi, and move to Jerusalem. And we have seen, there is a trend in the States. It's not because they were marrying a Jew. No. You have a trend of Black Americans, of African Americans, converting to Judaism. Nothing to do with the Black Jews who move as a group, as a community to Israel. They are still there. There have been certain controversy. No. This is not Sammy Davis Jr., having a reform conversion. No. This is a trend. It's not a trend, but you are seeing Black Jews becoming Jews, moving through Israel, being part of very close communities like a Haredi community in Jerusalem. Again, very fluid identities. Then you have also other Jews that you can see there. Shlomo Sand is an Israeli historian. I don't know if you're familiar with his book, The Invention of the Jewish People, a quite controversial book. And then the sequence, the second book, which is The Invention of Eretz Israel. Well, Shlomo Sand, an Israeli historian, he renounced publicly and actually wrote a book in 2014. He renounced his Jewishness. He said, I don't want to be a Jew anymore. He's an anti-Zionist. He still lives in Israel. He identifies himself as Israeli, but he doesn't want to do anything with his Judaism. Then you have these ladies praying. Where? In Iquitos. These, if you look at them, they are very, very, they look as the First Nations of Peru. But they identify themselves because somewhat they are the descendants of these Moroccan Jews who settled in Iquitos, in the Peruvian, in the Amazonian jungle in Peru. And this is actually, Ariel Segal confirmed that to me, that this picture is in a prayer room. They don't have a synagogue in Iquitos, certainly. In a praying room that they have there. And they are praying. And they are learning to pray in Hebrew. And let me tell you something. Some of these descendants of the Tawny Moroccans, now they live in Israel. And some of them are Orthodox Jews. And then you have the question of this I don't know how to call it, this question of, okay, let's become Sephardi. And then you have 6,000 Venezuelans who didn't have zero connection to Judaism, then being aware that I don't know how and why they had a connection. It's a very opportunistic thing. But it's more than that, because I know, and I have connection with people who went through this process, that for them was a big discovery. They didn't know anything about Judaism or anything. They didn't know anything about Sepharad. And they discovered that. They learned about that. I'm not saying that they will become Jews. No. But it's kind of a discovery process. Then you have this big question, and I know that we have a standard answer. Mi Yehudi. Who is a Jew? Okay, yes, we have a standard answer. Whoever was born of a Jewish mother or whoever converted to Judaism according to the Halakha, the Jewish law. But the thing is a little bit more complex, as we can see. And I think, Mi Yehudi, even in Israel, doesn't have a clear answer. Thank you very much.